Welcome to this featured session of the Maxi Wow Lit Test. The theme under discussion is the mighty Cholas, masters of the land and seas. And I have a rare privilege to moderate this panel with two wonderful authors who I think are mighty in their own right. I have to my right Amish, who is undoubtedly the architect of modern Indian he is really the one who shaped mythological and historical fiction. He donned several hats, from a banker to a diplomat, writer, author, a broadcaster, very successful at that too. And of course, I believe you're coming up with a movie next year. Oh, this year. Okay, great. And of course, on my left is Mr. Krishnan. He's an author and a historian and has done extensive research in South Indian history. Now, before I begin, I must admit that this was rather challenging, and I think Eka got it right, to navigate between the two works because their portrayal of Cholas is so different. So while reading Amish's work, you get this very high-octane, emotional, almost cinematic account of the Cholas. And, Krishnan brings in the very sober account grounded in historical realism and epigraphic evidence. So it's quite a balancing act that I had to do, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading both the books. The larger objective, I think, and I'm sure the authors will agree with me, was really, and I'm using Mr. Krishnan's word, is to correct the period of collective amnesia. And that's why they've really written these books, and that's why we're going to be interrogating them. I also must say that I think the timing of this and the framing of this literature festival is incredibly timely because, the geopolitical anxieties around maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz will potentially, uplift this discussion from a pure lesson in history to maybe geopolitical analysis. And with my background in international relations and my research on the Shastra, I hope to interrogate both your works from that lens of strategic culture. Let's dive into the discussion. And I want to begin with this aspect of the Cholas, which is something that they are remembered for and something for which they're seen as exceptions because India's had a coastline which stretches across several thousand kilometers. It has always had it, that's geography. It has had empires which have hosted international trade far and wide. And yet, there's only one empire which really had an established naval force, a naval fleet, and that is the Cholas. And the other exception, which I think is quite striking, and this is really where I want the responses of both the authors to come in, is this understanding of Bharatvarsh, and you mentioned that in your book, Amish, about, south of the Himalayas, north of the seas, almost 1,000 yojanas, west to east, is also the understanding, both Puranic cosmological understanding of who we are and where we belong territorially, but is also called the Chakravarti Kshetra in Shastra, the limits of geographical expansion even of the modern period. And it was only the Cholas that we really saw, escapades outside, breaking out of this Chakravarti Kshetra to the southeast of Asia. And while they're an exception, they ended up doing it. So I want to just get your responses on why do you think they ended up doing it? What was really the core impetus and with what outcomes? So maybe we can begin with Amish and then Mr. Krishnan.
I think at the beginning, the first step is to understand how our history doesn't do fair justice to our maritime traditions. Just like, frankly, a history of the wars where India has fought over the last 75, 80 years doesn't do justice to what the Navy has done. Many of our battles have been spoken of, Battle of Lonavala, etc. Movies have been made, but the fantastic and utterly brilliant attack on Karachi is not covered as much, right? And similar to that, even in our history books, there is this obsessive focus with Delhi, particularly the history of the last 1,000 years, that apparently anything that's important happened only between Khyber and Agra. And when you have such a perspective of history, our history books portray us essentially as an agrarian, land-based empire, right? Which is certainly true of the area of Khyber to Agra. It's true of that area. It's not true of all of India. As you said rightly, that's not just, it's a part of India, and ancient India. It's not the only part. Uttaram yat samudra se madre chaiva dakshina varsham tada bharatam nama bharti yatra samprati, as our ancestors say. North of the ocean, south of the Himalaya, lies the land of Bharat. There live the descendants of Bharat. And there's a long coastline from Sindh all the way down to Bangladesh, which since ancient times has had rich maritime tradition from Indus Valley times. Right? That's why our coins have been found across. They had heavy trade. Emperor Vespasian had tried to ban trade with India because Rome was going, this 2000 years ago, because Rome was going bankrupt, importing things from India and paying in silver and gold. And since we don't get an adequate understanding of this, we don't realize how deep our maritime tradition were. In fact, we were the OG navigators. We were the ones who actually traveled the furthest in ancient times. We were the ones who developed many of the concepts of navigation. And there's a geological reason for this. Because in ancient times, before the engine, you traveled with the sail, right? With the wind. And the problem, all of you remember your school geography class. Trade winds blow only in one direction, right? You know that. So that was the problem with sailing in ancient times. Egypt to Crete, just a few days. Crete back to Egypt. You are sailing against the wind. It will take a few weeks. There's only one ocean on Earth. Only one ocean where the winds change direction, like clockwork, every year. Which is that ocean? Indian Ocean. The monsoon system. Right? In the winter months, winds blow out. In the summer monsoon, winds blow back. We could make an annual round trip. How many of you are from Odisha? Anyone from Odisha? Have you heard of the Bali Yatra, sir? What is the Bali Yatra? Correct, from Cuttack, and you travel out, right? It's the sea voyage to Bali. When does it happen? Usually around winter time. Yeah, because that's when the winds support your sail out. It's an ancient tradition, and this was true all across the coastal lands of India. We haven't been taught this because we are so obsessed with Delhi. Delhi is important, don't get me wrong. But it's not the only part of it, right? Which brings me, finally, to the question that you asked, which is how the Cholas were different. The only way the Cholas were different was that they did it with the force of arms. Everyone else, practically everyone else who went earlier, went as traders, went as storytellers, and we influenced much of the rest of the world. I mean, Southeast Asia was Hinduized and Buddhized by Indian traders who went out there. The Navy did this fantastic Cautilian voyage, right? I'm sure everyone is aware of it. Where did the original Cautilian go to? Anyone has any idea? Cambodia. He set up he was an Indian, yeah, and he set up one of the original kingdoms out there. So he was like the OG adventurer. Okay, and there must have been many Condanias who went out who died on the way. Yeah. So we influenced much of the world through trade and this thing. Cholas did it by rebels.
Yeah, just to add to that, you asked about the identification with Bharat. So Cholas, if you actually look at it, they have come from a very small area of the delta of Kaveri. It's a very small region if you look at the geography of the country. But that never stopped from them identifying themselves with the entire country. Be it any of those inscriptions, copper plates, literary sources, they always identified that with a bigger entity of Bharat. They called themselves as somebody who descended from Chola dynasty. They proudly proclaimed that they are Surya Vanshis. They said that they were descendants of Rama. In fact, many of the copper plates specifically mentions that. And from the Vedic and Agamic traditions, which were prevalent throughout, they have actually adopted most of the rituals. And in fact, the Manusmriti, which is being sort of now criticized in many of the forums, is one they have very proudly proclaimed that they were the followers of the Manusmriti, which many of the other kingdoms didn't do that. even Guptas they went by Yakimakis and others, but Cholas, being far south, they said that they ruled based on Manusmriti. So, be it as scriptures or Quranic traditions, they have identified with many of the Quranic figures as their forefathers, and they very proudly say that we are descendants of Bhagirata, we are descendants of Mantava. So, they actually documented that clearly in their inscriptions. And if you look at their rituals, the rituals they perform is all Vedic. So, overall, from an Var perspective, they have always identified with us as a civilization dash. True.
No, so I'm absolutely not disputing Cholas identifying with the Indians and the Bharatvarsh. My question is, why did they break out of this mold that was so sacrosanct, at least during the modern empire, about sticking to this very sacred geocultural space called the Chakravarti Kshetra? Why did they move to the Srivijaya Empire? Were they as concerned about the state of Malacca as we are about the state of Hormuz?
So I think Srivijaya, I think we can talk to know for ages. That was a very specific incident of a trade dispute because the trade of Cholas, which actually grew multifold during the 10th and 11th century, were threatened by the Srivijaya Empire, and their trading partner, which they saw China as one of their major trading partners, because of the fact that the Srivijaya, the Malacca state, and the Indonesia, they formed a pivotal part for Cholas to go all the way to China. They have blocked. It's typically like today we are seeing a situation where most of the ships are blocked because they cannot cross it. So if we identify that, their entire trading route was affected, due to which they have to launch. It's actually one of the questions.
So trade was critical to them.
Yeah. And in fact, utterly right, sir. All my research I studied in Tamil Nadu. Many of these things are there. Among the things was actually these voyages, the military voyages, were financed by the guilds of those years, right? So we are one of the largest East India Company, Dutch East India Company, one of the first of the. We had the OG kind of multinational trading firms as well, with evocative names like the 500, which was if any Kannadigas here. Yeah, the original. Ayole, correct. Yeah. So many of them actually were funded. It was a big dispute. There was a Strait of Hormuz situation 1,000 years ago, and the Chola Emperor said, "The hell with this! I'm going to break it."
Great. Yeah. So I just wanted to hear that and be clear on that. Okay.
I'm not suggesting they have to do the hell with it. Strait of Hormuz.
Okay. Mr. Krishnan, in your book, you meticulously document what you think in today's world should be called Operation Garland or the String of Pearls. And you mention how the Chola Navy really projected strength, force in the seas. It guarded and secured both trade and territory. But a lot of the war route or the victories of these strategic missions flow back into the granite of the Brihadeshwar, right? And you also mentioned this fact, which is also confirmed in Amish's account, that Rajendra Chola's northern expedition essentially brought the Ganges water back to consecrate the temple, right? Ganga Chola Kondapuram is mentioned in Amish's book. Amish himself, if you read his account, is full of the phrase righteous vengeance. There is a lot of religious frenzy and a religious undergirding to the entire mission of Ghazni. So I just want to hear from you both, since you both talk so much about the temple being, civilizational anchors and administrative hubs. If it would be reasonable to say that the Chola emperors were not just good practitioners of strategy, but also devoted Shaivites, and whether that was really the software which was driving and ran the military hardware for the Chola Empire. And I know here I'm going to have different answers from both of you, and I'm hoping so. So we'll begin with Mr. Krishnan before we.
Yeah, I'll split this into two parts. First, we'll talk about the Southeast Asian expedition. Recently, we have celebrated or commemorated the 1,000 years of the expedition. It happened in 2025. So last year, we had the 1,000 years of the expedition.
We had Amish's book come last year, which is very timely too. Yeah.
So the reason we again mentioned just now, the trade with China was significantly affected by the CBJ empire. CBJ was one of the mightiest empires at that time, and they were competing with both Arabs and the Indians in the trade with China, and they have sent emissaries to the Chinese emperor's court, saying that Cholas were actually a vassal state of us. They were secondary. So what happened is in the trade, most favored nation, like if you take this commodity of today, the China degraded Cholas to the second or third grade. So the traders are not getting the kind of audience to the Chinese companies as CVG offers. In addition, the ships which are actually going through the CVG, they were actually pulled into the ports of CVG. And the CVG Empire, in fact, collected a lot of money from literally. So this is Rajendra Chola. I think that is the reason this particular operation was launched, and it was not to conquer the area. That was not the intention. The Operation Garland, which you have actually described, to create a shock in the minds of Srivijaya, who thought that they were actually one of the strong naval forces at that time. So if you actually look at, there are about 13 places where the Chola Navy went, all the way from the east coast to the east coast to the west coast. And 13 ports of Srivijaya, which were very strategic places, all of them were attacked. And they sort of created a kind of impact in the Srivijaya that they have to finally come into agreement with Cholas, saying that we will not do anything with you. And in fact, somebody mentioned there was a regime change which happened in the Srivijaya only because of this particular attack of Cholas. So I think that created a strategic impact, and the trading guilds like IIO, the Nana Desis, who were very, very prominent, and then they started putting their outposts all over Indonesia, Malaysia, all the way up to China. You can see those trading posts, inscriptions, and the temples built by them in those places actually. So this created, it was not a military but a trading context, if we can actually say. So that is one. And in terms of the Ganga expedition, so coming back to the software hardware part, there were strong religious sites, no doubt about it. And the temple building started long back before the era of Rajaraja and Rajendra. So what they have done is whenever they go to these lands, take money, come here, they use that wealth to build these temples. So it is not because they wanted to build a temple, they went and taken money. It's the other way around. If you actually look at the Ganges expedition, the reason why Rajendra went all the way to north is because he wanted to consecrate the newly built temple in the new capital to the holy water. There are so many holy rivers in India, but he considered Ganga as the holiest. So, in fact, in one of his inscriptions, he mentions that just like Bhagiratha went all the way and then did the penance to bring Ganga all the way from the heaven to earth. Rajendra actually went all the way to north to bring Ganga to his capital. So he actually creates that scenario. So that is what his intention. Now the rest of the things came all along with. So he got money. Even he got some of the Murtis who actually took all the way and then consecrated in the new capital. That way.
Thank you. Do you have a different answer?
Yeah, no, regrettably, I agree very largely to what Mr. Krishnan is saying. If you wanted a TV panel discussion, that's not happening. Where's my friend from XMD
The entire mission is
that's not happening.
Yeah,
true. But look, a few things on your question. One, yes, they were clearly they were Shaivites. They were very proud Shaivites. They showed that in their temples and the architecture and the sculptures they put outside. There's this very famous sculpture of Lord Shiva sitting on Kerala Mountain, and Rajaraja Chola and Rajendra Chola kind of standing as servants with a fan to Lord Shiva. They're very devout Shaivites. But no discrimination on religion. They funded Buddhist Vihara, they funded Vaishnava temples. So there was no discrimination on religion. That's something that must be noted. But they weren't defensive about their faith at all. They were very proud of it. Second thing, yes, those attacks were, and in Southeast Asia, were driven largely by trade issues. It wasn't a religious issue because in the Sri Lanka was actually Hindu and Buddhist. So there's no real religious issue.
I was just wondering because Brihadeshwar, the ambitious project that it was, would be a money guzzler in those times. And where did you get that money? You would only get it through trade.
One of the things that you find in the tradition of the kings and emperors of ancient India, they didn't build giant palaces or mausoleums for themselves. They built public architecture, they built temples, they built roads, they built canals. So there are canals that the Cholas built that survive to this day, right? And it wasn't just the Cholas. King Bhoj, for example, built great waterworks and lakes. So you'll find most of the ancient rulers. You'll find the temples that they built. You'll find Uttar Path, Dakshin Path, which were actually the highways of ancient India. You really don't find their palaces or their. So you look at. I don't know how many of you have been to Rajan Chora's. It's such a simple samadhi. One of the greatest Indian emperors ever. But all their funds would go on public infrastructure, not for giant palaces for themselves.
Right. Just wanting to add on the temples, right? So when they started building the temple, yeah, it is primarily religious for devotion, etc. But if you look at temples like Brigadeshwara or Vengagonda Chola, they were institutions in themselves. They serve multi-purpose. It is not only for religious purpose. It actually stimulated a lot of economic activity. Most of the economic schemes introduced by Cholas were on two temples. Tanjavur temple had in fact two treasuries. Can you believe? And then they were serving as banks and lenders. So there were multiple reasons for this.
And in fact, he's so right. All the temples, he really should correct. You're so right because the temples, he's right. They served as banks, as venture capital for traders, and all the profits were essentially used for charity, right? So in the north, many of the temples, I don't know how many of you are aware, are actually run by the Indian government or the local state government. Sadly, now in south as well. And so they've destroyed many of the ancient traditions. But till the temples were destroyed in the invasion, then south, the tradition is still there. Someone would come outside, one of the priests, and ring the bell 3 times. Is anyone hungry? Is anyone hungry? Is anyone hungry? Okay, and then they would give free food. That's what the prasad used to be. They used to give free education. The temple pond was the water security of that area. So they actually worked like banks and then social service organization. All that profits was used for that.
Okay, now this is really going to work. So reading your work, Amish, I was very gladdened to see so many instances of the Chanakyan. I mean, you make references to Chanakya, you make references to the Arthashastra. The whole mission itself was the word instead of a word because of the power asymmetry between the two parties. You talk about Sam, Dan, Dan. Even little things. I mean, that jewel from Abu Qasim's body was straight a leaf out of the Buddha Rakshasa, right? And you do, the sense that I get after reading the book is that you thought that the Cholas acknowledged and practiced some of the best practices of statecraft established in the Arthashastra, except of course I was slightly quizzical about the Gujarati merchant Someshwar having a better knowledge of the Arthashastra than Narsimhan, the Chola general. So that because he was telling the Chola general about how covert mission would be more successful than an overt one. But I was extremely happy to read those references because I am, I hold this view that there is a line of strategic culture which you can really see going through these various periods, and you really need to be very, very discerning to be able to figure that out. But coming to your work, Mr. Krishnan, there is not a single reference of the Arthashastra. I know you translated Thomas Trotman's book in Tamil. I know you know the Arthashastra really well for you to draw those parallels with the Chola Empire, if you thought there were any. In fact, you begin your book with this line saying that the Cholas represented the many firsts. And I know you're right because you're referring to land surveys and village councils and administrative reforms and irrigation system, etc., which of course they were pioneers in doing. But I really want to, find out from you both your sense of the continuing Cautilian legacy up till this medieval period, the Chola Empire, of which you both are such great exponents.
I think in the Indian tradition, there has been the Chanakyan tradition, which many emperors have followed. There was, I'm forgetting his name, you know Mr. Krishnan, who was in the Gupta age. Kumar, I'm forgetting the exact name. So, who was much more of like the tradition that we follow now, which was much nicer and and about let's be nice to everyone, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that kind of attitude. Whereas Acharya Chanakya was very realist, right? And his entire thing was that the king doesn't have the luxury of having soft thoughts and nice ideologies. He or she, have female rulers as well, does not have that luxury. Because their job is to maintain order. Their job is to ensure that Matsya Nyaya, which is the law of the jungle, does not come into the kingdom. Then the kingdom is safe and you can have the social processes that you want. Right? So there were actually both these traditions. And some emperors have followed one, some emperors have followed the other. Chhatrapati Shivaji was more Chanakya, right? But Prithviraj Chauhan, he was a warrior, but he was not really Chanakya. He was on the other side. So Emperor Ashok, for example, is very interesting king in some ways, but he was certainly not Chanakya. He had this thing that I have to guide my people to a better moral framework. Hey, who are you to decide? Let them decide. Your job is to maintain order. That was Chanakya's thing. So, for example, Emperor Ashok encouraged, he had this, the Dhamma who used to essentially, who used to encourage things like vegetarianism and other things. Whereas Chanakya's approach was, it's not your job as a king. Let the people decide. You maintain order, which means stay focused on the enemy outside, maintain order inside, and let the society. All these things were there. I'm perhaps more of a Chanakya. Maybe that's what reflects in my.
I don't completely agree with you, but we can talk about that later, not for this panel.
Yeah, see, you mentioned that the reference of Sastra is not there, because obviously Chola didn't refer it in any of those regards. But I think though it was not explicitly said, if we actually look at the way they have governed the country, they have actually gone by the principles or most of the principles of what Chanakya is. And they have innovated or sort of come back with some of the first pioneering stuff in terms of their governance. They have abolished the kind of republic system at the lowest level, at the village council level, at the national level, where people can elect their representatives. At the same time, the king was the supreme authority. And Arthasastra also sort of ensures that there is a proper administrative setup which needs to be there, right from the king all the way to council of ministers, etc., to ensure that the governance happens. And if you look at the copybook of Cholas, exactly they have done that. All the way up to village, they have put officials who can keep record keeping, who can keep meticulous records, which you can see in some of the inscriptions, the kind of mathematical calculation they have arrived at, how the land was surveyed, and how the revenue was calculated per unit of land, and who's going to keep the record, who's going to collect it, who's going to audit, and how the accounts are verified, and what happens if somebody didn't submit proper account, what exactly is the punishment given. Everything is very clearly documented. So that is a kind of administrative setup which in fact gives measurable outcome on how they govern the entire country. So that is actually come right from the Arthasastra. And talk about economy, agrarian was predominantly our economy at that time, but they have given the flip to the trading economy so much, right from the 9th, 10th centuries. And that was a major case.
So, in fact, I was hoping you would bring in economy first, because the Arthashastra is about a political economic approach to statecraft, and materialism is the very basis of statecraft. Okay, we will come to the merchant guilds. I don't think we can complete a conversation on the Cholas without them. So, the sense that I get from reading both your accounts of the merchant guilds is that they were just not just commercial class, but they were a real stakeholder in the Chola Empire. I mean, they had their own personal militaries, they had international trading outposts, they had commercial connections with several people. I mean, we hear that account, Someshwar, in your book, who actually gets critical intelligence for the mission Ghazni because of his contacts. He also said that he has read The Enemy even before Narasimhan had come back. So I really see him as that scholar warrior, adding to that mission. And Mr. Krishnan, of course, has spoken about the merchant guilds. I just want to understand from you that this very interesting and innovative public-private partnership to manage maritime security is a good template that could be a lesson for contemporary maritime doctrines. Do you think would you advise that?
I couldn't agree more. Look, we need all sources of power and strength. Acharya Chanakya had said, Sukhasya Moolam Dharma, Dharmasya Moolam Artha. If there's no wealth and the power that comes with it, nothing else can be built. So among the things that troubles me of the India of today is this really anti-industrialist, anti-trader, anti-capitalist attitude. Socialism is not an Indian ideology. It is an ideology invented by two frankly sociopathic Germans. Okay? And wherever that philosophy has been tried, it has led to nothing but complete economic and social disaster. It has been experimented for 100 years. Most of my readers are young among, not so much in India, but the UK, US, I'm surprised how many youngsters actually think socialism is a good idea. Maybe it's just not been implemented right. It's been implemented for 100 years. It has failed every single time. 100 million people have died thanks to socialism. So this would certainly be Acharya Chanakya's philosophy. You need the power that comes with wealth as well. You need the entire society to work together. You need the armed force, you need the warriors, you need the traders, you need the intellectuals, you need the artists, you need everyone to work. And it shouldn't swing on either extreme. No one should become too powerful. That's what creates a strong society. So I'm not saying you need to swing to the other extreme where the entire country is held hostage to business interests. That tends to happen in the US at times, frankly. Right? That's not good either. Right? But every source of power needs to be harnessed for a strong society, for a strong country, including wealth. We need to celebrate our business. Not those who are doing chori, but those who are actually having that, yes, we must celebrate.
I think that is a very valid point, which is very brilliantly you can see it in Cholas. There is absolutely no record of any direct connection between the business and the government. You will never see that they are hand in hand or they are helping each other. But it is an unwritten agreement where they have supported each other very well. The trading guilds have their own administrative setup. They have governed specific regions. You can see them, they have the right to give grants to the temple, they can manage the temple, they can take the revenue from that. So you can see that they have become such a large powers. And if you look at the way they have protected the trade, the kings, it's not that just an odd expedition to Southeast Asia. It was actually a planned strategy. Even during Rajaraja Chola's time, you see him attacking the current Maldives, the Lakshadweeps by Rajendra, because there were a lot of pirates who were threatening those trading ships, which is actually traveling through that. So the first is to cull all the pirates, ensure that the ships go freely. Then comes the competition between the other nations. So very meticulously they have ensured that this is done to take care of the interest of the business. But there is no directly they're saying that agreement saying that I will protect you. This is what you need to do for nothing of that sort. But still that is coming.
May I add one thing, particularly for the I don't know so much about the 500. I need to do more research on this. But there used to be guilds in North India as well. And there's this research that's been done on temples around Bareilly. Bareilly used to be Panchal actually, and somewhere all those areas. So with guilds, almost 80 to 90% of the donations made by guild members were women. Okay, so they're like women traders, women metalworking guild, or and matlab, A, they were making money, B, they had the agency. I want to donate to this temple and my name will be on that donation.
Mr. Krishnan, my understanding was that at least for military naval expeditions, there was a hand in hand between the merchant guilds And this is really, in keeping with the modern times as well, because in Shastra we talk about a whole Shreni Bal, which is the force which came from the merchant guild, and they were those, ready soldiers for the for the state to take recourse to when needed. Right? They were in fact rated third most important after their own standing army. So I'm wondering, even the Cholas might have had really a hand in glove with the merchant guilds to execute these naval expeditions successfully.
There were two sorts of military. One is the traders themselves had their own militaries. Even the land traders, they actually carry their own army. Similarly for the sea trade also. But an extended way, the kingdom protected. But it is not that there is an agreement or whatever, but just in case if the trading is facing any threats, the army was ready to protect them.
Fair enough. Okay, now we come to the so what of the discussion. We've learned so much about the Cholas from both your books. We know that the Cholas just didn't own the naval force, they really had a command over the seas, and from the postcards of the modern empire, we've really seen a naval force come to shape in the Cholas, which projected power, which secured trade, which went out and did, territorial expeditions. If you were to name and point out one Chola DNA trait which you think the Indian Navy today, contemporary India's Indian Navy, should integrate in its military maritime doctrine, what should that be and why?
I think among the things that the Cholas had, and actually many of our ancient emperors had, is a clear strategic understanding of the situation. There's this concept that you should have Yug Bodh, Para Bodh, Shatru Bodh, and Swayam Bodh. Understand the age that you live in, understand others. They may be allies, but that doesn't mean they're going to align with you all the time. Understand what makes them work. Understand Shatru Bodh. This silliness that all of us are human beings, we all love each other. That's silly. It doesn't work. There are some people who will always be your enemy. Understand that. And Swayam Bodh. What is your own strengths and be clear about your own weaknesses. Right? Don't just stumble into wars just because. And we see that happening, right now, where diplomats, former diplomat, I won't name, but they all know, what happened. It wasn't a well thought through operation. Thank you for your attention to this matter. But that clarity, particularly at a time like this, history goes through phases like this. There's like a phase, last time it lasted 70, 80 years, where there's a stable global order, there's a clear hegemon, everyone has to adapt to that situation. And then you get these phases of 10, 15 years, right, where there's chaos. And if you play that game right, your country benefits for the next 75, 80 years. We didn't play the game right the last time something like this happened. It wasn't our fault. We weren't a free country at that time. Right? In 1945, the game for us was played by the UK, which had its own agenda, right? And we suffered for it for 8 years. Now the entire board is being shaken up. We must have absolute clarity what we need to do. Don't just randomly jump into wars. And most importantly, at times like this, I cannot stress it enough. We Indians, we are the kind of people where you put 10 Indians in the room, you'll get 21 opinions. Because each Indian will have 2 opinions. Often an Indian is arguing with himself. Forget about arguing with others. But at least at a time like this 10, 15 years, let's be very clear about the importance of unity. This is not the time for us silly fights on language, religion, caste. We'll get time for that after 15 years. This time it's so important that India plays its cards right. Our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will benefit from it. This clarity, I think, the Cholas have. They are among the few emperors where the successor would start ruling while from what I recall, while the older emperor was still alive. Like, think of the succession planning. Clarity.
I think the one area which is very important is anticipating what's going to happen maybe they would see through the dispute of the Srivijaya and Cholas about 50, 60 years or even 100 years back. Uh, it is not triggered by just because there's a trade dispute, they launched an attack all the way, audacious attack, right? So that is always there. The fearlessness, it's all need to be there. But the groundwork, what happened, is much before. Imagine during Rajaraja's time, Srivijaya was a very friendly country with Cholas. They have come all the way and then built a Buddha Vihara in Nagapattinam. And the grants were given by Rajaraja, which is ratified by Rajendra Chola, that those were the copper plate inscription which is still lying in the Netherlands. So, if you look at it, despite that kind of a very quasi relationship, they know that someday is going to happen. So, what they have done is they have conquered all the ports of India. The Ganges expedition, apart from the fact that it served for bridging the Ganga, they have ensured that they are in control of ports right from Kanyakumari up to the Bengal. And that ensured that they're very clear, the control of coast is very clear. They have already conquered Kerala. So most of the coast of the India is under their control before they launch an attack. So I think that gave them that strategic advantage.
Okay, with that, thank you, gentlemen. I want to open the floor for questions from the audience for the panelists. So there's a gentleman there with his hand raised.
Good morning, sir. I'm Commander Chandan English. Whenever history is written or rewritten, there are always biases, personal biases of the authors, the compulsions that are imposed by those who are making him write, and the biases that the author perceives for the audience's requirement for maybe in this contemporary age for selling the books. So how, and when you write these books and rewrite the history, how do you keep yourself away from these biases so that you present a history that was true to that timeline? Thank you.
It is actually a very tough job, to be very precise, to keep away from the biases. But I think when you're trying to be true to the history from a documentation perspective, when I say documentation, it is the sources. It is the sources from where you started writing the history. If you are true to that, then actually that comes. The bias will go off because of the fact that, and it is not only one source you think, which you will take and then which I start writing because it suits my way of thinking. You try to compare that with the contrasting evidence and then see you argue with yourself. At least personally, what I do is I'll try to argue and then see that why it should be true. What is the contra evidence? Is there anything there? So I think to an extent, see the problem is you can write one book, two books, but over the period, if you try to be biased, that can be easily found from people and then the trust is lost.
I think what I would say is the fiction that has been propagated over the last few decades by elites in the West and elites in India as well, that their version is the unbiased version. That is what is actually fiction. There is no unbiased version of any history ever. There is no unbiased story anywhere ever. Very obviously, the author's perspective will color what he sees. Okay? The fiction is saying that I am unbiased. No one is unbiased. Right? No one is. But it is in an author's interest to read many contrary accounts as he can. Like one of the things I do, right? I like to read books of those I disagree with. Okay. So, for example, I think the British Raj was utterly terrible. Okay. I think there was some good that India got from it as well. Okay? But someone like Niall Ferguson or David Starkey, they actually think they saved India. The British Raj saved India. It is nonsense, right? But they are scholarly guys. So I like to read their books. So I'm not reading, the books of a troll. That serves no purpose. Like read the an opposing point of view, but from the scholars of that opposing point of view. Why should you do that? Because you guys are all armed forces guys, right? It's resistance builds muscle, right? It's the same thing for your brain as well. Resistance builds your brain. If you are just listening to a viewpoint that keeps reinforcing your existing viewpoint, your brain starts becoming weak. Read opposing point, but read the scholars of the opposing point of view. Speak to others who may have a different point of view. It will actually grow your mind, and you'll automatically find your arguments become better, your story becomes better. But this thing that, and this fiction was taught to us Indians as well. Historians who wrote 50s, 60s, 70s, oh, I am. That's bullshit. No one is. Everyone has their, comes with their perspective, which is fair enough. How can you be a human being and not have your perspective?
I think we have time for this one more question.
Okay. Hello. Yeah.
And who would that be?
I am. So my question is to both of you. During the Cholas period of time, we had a strong naval presence, strong maritime thing. What happened next, and why our maritime history got stuck somewhere, or why couldn't we continue that?
My reading, the Turkic invasions. Like people like Malik Kafur, for example, who was an Indian, but that's why his name is Kafur. Kafur is, I think, Kafur. He was a convert. But people like him destroyed many of the temples which funded these trading voyages. They destroyed many of the guilds. And the Turks were essentially, they weren't from Turkey, I'm sure you know that. They were from Central Asia. Right? They were Turks, Mongols, Syrians, these are all cousin tribes. They weren't really traders, they weren't seafarers. Right? They were like the Dothrakis in the Game of Thrones. In fact, Dothrakis are based on the Turks. Okay? So they were essentially horse riders, killers, basically. They were just killers. They weren't traders. So now, if they are controlling much of the revenue, the property, obviously the funding for naval voyages comes down. You notice even in the Ottoman Turks, the Ottomans themselves weren't really great seafarers. They used to get a Venetian to do their trading. I think that's what happened in India, which is why you see the revival of naval traditions when those who were more rooted in India started becoming powerful, like the Maratha. Right? That's my view. Basically, the Turks.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is, see, everything has to come to an end, and so is Chola's regime. But what happened next is this total destruction of our entire space. And there was nobody to sort of stand up to that. First, till obviously Marathas came up and that revived our.
We have time. We have time for more questions. I want to hand it to the lady here, please.
Thank you. I'm Julie Shidram. I'm a journalist, and it's related to the questions that the gentleman behind me asked. There is this tendency of fictionalizing history, and a lot of them get made into movies. What happens with the younger generation, unfortunately, whose reading habits or research habits are virtually nil? They start believing this to be history, and then the narrative changes, and in the generations down the line, whatever they watch in movies or fictionalized part. So there is one portion where you cannot, in a fiction, say this is history documented, this is fiction. That unfortunately cannot happen. How will you, as authors, deal with this?
Historical fiction as a genre is actually centuries old. It's been around for a long time. And those stories impact the way we think, of course it does. And it's not just in the genre of history, in historical fiction, in all genres. In fact, I have tons of friends in the Bay Area, various others. They told me much of the design for the flip phones, that was done by engineers, actually was from Star Trek fiction. Okay, so fiction obviously impacts how you think, right? Sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. A surprising number of Indians today actually think Akbar looked like Prithviraj Kapoor. Okay, and then he looked Indian. I don't know if you've seen the Amar Chitta comic on Akbar. He actually looked like Prithviraj Kapoor. And Akbar did not look Indian. Right? He was a Turco-Mongol. To us, he would have looked Chinese. Right? But if you show most modern Indians that picture, there's a where's the. They did not speak Urdu, by the way. Okay, Urdu is our language. They were spoken Turkic or Persian. Okay? So, Braveheart, for example, there's tons of fiction in there. William Wallace did exist. But I assure you, he did have an affair with the French princess who became the English queen, and it's his line on the throne. That's nonsense. But it makes for good storytelling. The way I see it is, what is the aim of that fiction? If the aim of that fiction is to spread discord and disunity today, then it's fine. If the aim of the fiction is to spread unity today, then it's good. So, to me, the intention matters far more than the story itself. I'm a believer in freedom of expression. So if someone has a wrong intention, I'm not going to say it should be wrong. But at least those of us who have the right intention, right with that frame.
I think this is a lesser evil than history textbooks telling wrong stories to children who believe that it's fact. Right? This is a lesser evil.
At least Amish and others who write historical fiction, they are very clear that it is historical fiction. So we know. But unfortunately, there are people who claim to be historians and then writing history. But in fact, they want to try to put their agenda, which is actually fiction. There are books for Cholas also, you would have seen. Right? So I think that is where the danger lies. It is important if I am a student of a history to go and then verify the actual sources rather than get biased by these books, which actually tells the real story.
Okay, we run out of time now. I'm sorry to meet the gentlemen outside. Maybe they'll answer more questions, but I just want to thank both of us.